October, bright and early at 9 o'clock in the morning. So thanks all for making it. I'm going to hand over to Town Clerk for the intro.
Good morning, members. Welcome to this meeting of the Local Plan Subcommittee. As you may be aware, the public element of the meeting is being recorded, and those participating in the meeting have given consent to their inclusion. The recording will be available on the City Corporation's YouTube channel following the meeting, and it shall be retained for up to 1 civic year. All personal data will be processed in accordance with the Data Protection Act 2018, and for any further information on that, please feel free to contact us.
Great, thank you very much. Turning then to item 1, apologies. We've received apologies from John Edwards. Hugh Selker has just said he will be here shortly. He's just running a bit late. And I think that's a full house otherwise. Item 2, does anyone have any items to declare under the Code of Conduct? I think we're good. Item 3, Town Clerk.
Item 3 is to elect a Deputy Chairman in accordance with Standing Order 26.6. This is because this is the first meeting of the subcommittee during the current year. An email was sent to members of the subcommittee on 1st of October, inviting anyone who so wished to submit an expression of interest in the role. The closing date for the receipt of nominations was 5 o'clock on Tuesday, 7th of October. I'm now able to confirm that 1 expression of interest was received by that deadline. That was received from Deputy John Edwards, who also submitted a supporting statement as requested. Mr Edwards, being the only member who has indicated a willingness to serve, is duly declared to be Deputy Chair for the ensuing year.
Thank you. Congratulations to John. We'll pass it on when we see him next. Item 4 are the minutes. This is quite funny. The minutes from the meeting in October 2023. So I've never seen minutes that old before. Does anyone have any questions or comments on the accuracy? I think you'll have to stretch your memories back. I think we're probably going to be okay to approve those. Are we okay, colleagues? Great, thank you. Great, okay, so item 5, the substantive item today, which is just by way of scene setting, the local plan, the city plan 2040 process has been taken, gosh, about 10 years, I think. It certainly began at least under Alistair when you were chair, maybe even under your predecessor. Blame him, yeah. And has gone on for some time. It was kind of in hiatus because of COVID, went through all the various processes and consultations and approvals internally. Most recently this year, the plan in what we considered our near final form was inspected by government inspectors. It was a very thorough process, and our officers here were in the room for days and days, defending the plan, presenting the plan, justifying the plan, often with those from different groups disagreeing on certain finer points. And the inspectors listened, and their report has now come back to us. And that report has main and additional modifications. So the purpose of today is for us to discuss those modifications, and if we are content, then to send them for further consultation before it comes back to us. I think it's probably important, perhaps Rob or Gudrun, you explain, did I get that part of the process right? And what's the kind of the status of those modifications? Is it a pick and choose? Is it you take them all or not? And other than that, if you can include that in your remarks and then kick off your presentation, that would be great.
Yeah, of course. Thank you very much, Chairman. I'll hand over to Gudrun, who's going to talk us through where we've got to, how we've got here, and then the stage we're at, and we can say a bit about the main modifications, their status, and the options that we have before us. So, Gudrun, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Rob. So yes, we have had the examination hearing sessions that took place between March and June this year. So just for a matter of clarification, from the moment of submission on the 29th of August until we get the final inspector's report, we are still in examination, but the formal hearing sessions have now concluded on, I think it was the 12th of June. So the planning inspectors are appointed directly by the Secretary of State, and they work for the Planning Inspectorate, and they are the ones who are then appointed to examine the plan in relation to 2 key factors: legal compliance, in terms of have we done all the followed the correct procedures in plan preparation, have we done all the correct consultations for the amounts of times that we're meant to, and have we addressed the comment, kind of acknowledge and address the comments correctly, and take into account all the requirements of the NPPF and the London plan. And the most notable within that, the duty to cooperate with our neighbouring boroughs. So the legal compliance is one of those two matters that the inspectors are looking into, and the inspectors cannot rectify legal compliance. So effectively, if we haven't met all those legal processes, then they cannot proceed with the examination, and the local plan can't eventually be adopted. We're pleased in the sessions that we got through essentially the legal compliance in day one. So we're happy with that. And then the inspectors then moved on to matters of soundness. So in terms of soundness, that's clearly set out in the NPPF. It's got 4 tests of soundness. And you'll see when we get to the main modifications that each one of those main modifications has been proposed to address one of those tests of soundness. And so the main modifications are required to make the plan sound. So without these main modifications, we cannot adopt the plan in its current form. In addition to those main modifications, there are what were called additional modifications. Those don't relate to soundness. Those are more minor amendments to the city plan to take account of factual updates, typographical errors, or just some minor tweaks to the policies or the policy text for clarification. And we'll come to those today as well. So in terms of next steps in the examination process, or the to move forward to adoption. So yeah, we're at local plan subcommittee today, and then we plan to take the paper through to planning and transportation on the 21st of October, policy and resources on the 13th of November, and Court of Common Council on the 4th of December. And that is to agree the consultation on the main modifications to the city plan. And we're proposing, following the hopefully getting through the decision at court on the 4th of December, we're proposing to commence that consultation in or around the 8th of December. And then, because that covers the kind of the Christmas holiday period, we're proposing to extend that until the end of January. And then we're going to do a very quick turnaround of all the responses that we received to the consultation. And the inspectors have already indicated they would like us to prepare a city corporation response to those responses, and that is also highlighted in the report that we're asking delegated authority to do so.
So just so to be very clear, today's meeting is to receive the modifications and then presumably to put them out to consultation. Yes. It's not about finalising the final. Okay, yes. Great. Thank you.
It's to agree the consultation on those made modifications, and then the next stage in the examination process, is that the inspectors will then consider the responses to the main modifications consultation and prepare a fact check report. We're hoping to receive that some point in May, depending on the inspector's timetable, which will be essentially just checking that for factual accuracies at that point. And then there will be a very swift turnaround once we've checked that to get the final report. And then once we have the final report, that's when we're free to proceed the governance process towards adoption, which we're hoping to do through taking back to planning and transportation, policy and resources, and then court before the summer recess next year. So we hope to have an adopted plan by the end of July next year. So in terms of the main modifications, so these are main modifications, so to address soundness issues that have been proposed by the inspectors to us. They are proposed without prejudice, so they are will be considering the comments that were received in the consultation in relation to whether people think that they are also sound and legally compliant. As I mentioned before, so they are to address soundness and so are required to get the plan adopted. We cannot adopt the plan without doing so, so we also cannot amend these main modifications. And then in terms of main modifications, there are 58 of those, which we consider those to be kind of a relatively low in number.
So if I can just come in here, because I think it's really important that we understand what the status of these main modifications are. And just to be really clear, they're the inspectors' modifications. They are ones that the inspectors have told us are necessary to make the plan sound. There's a procedure guide, the government's procedure guide, that's published for local plan examinations. And if you'll allow me, I'll just quote a couple of sentences from that. So it says that Throughout the examination, the inspector will explore the potential for modifications to resolve the soundness and legal compliance issues that they have identified. Section 27C of the Planning and Compulsory Purchase Act requires the inspector to recommend main modifications if asked to do so by the local planning authority, which we have asked the inspectors to do so. Any change to the submitted plan that would materially affect one or more of the plan's policies can only be made as a main modification recommended by the inspector. So that's the stage we're at. These are, as I say, the inspector's modifications. They will be subject to consultation, which will then again be considered by the inspectors before we get the final report from the inspectors. So hopefully that's clear. This is not an immediately obviously straightforward process, but that's the stage we're at.
Okay. What's next?
So we want to take you through some of the more significant main modifications, so you have a chance to scrutinise them, to understand what the changes are and the potential implications of those. And first of all, members won't be surprised at all that the main issue that was discussed during the examination, or the most significant issue, was around heritage and tall buildings. So Tom Nancollis, our Assistant Director of Design, is here to talk you through the modifications that were made in relation to tall buildings. Tom.
Thanks, Rob. So good morning, everyone. So there are two key changes to policy S12, which is our main tall buildings policy in the plan. And those are shown here at high level on the screen. They entail the addition of a tall building site in addition to the two clusters that were proposed, and amendments to the contour lines in the city cluster itself. And these changes arose through statements of common ground with respondents to the plan's consultation. So to start with the new tall building site, you can see it just up in the top of the city there in the northeast. This is an individual site called Broadwalk House, but in the plan called the Broadgate Tall Building Site. And through a series of kind of discussions with the respondent, with whom we agreed the statement of common ground, we arrived at a form and contour lines arrangement, which takes the form of two sort of towers, one higher than the other, and a channel between the two of them. This particular proposal was felt to be acceptable because it slots very neatly into an established group of tall buildings, an informal cluster that already exists in this area, and crucially would not change or alter the spirit of what policy S12 is trying to achieve, which is to minimise the possibility of harm to the three strategic landmarks, St Paul's, the Tower and the Monument. And in all the views which are assessed in detail in our addendum to the evidence that we published and which was subsequently discussed at the hearings, this was set out. We set this out very clearly. So that is the Broadgate Tall Building Site, and we can of course take questions and discussion on that, but I wanted to give a high-level summary. The next main area of amendments is in the cluster itself. Do we have an image of that in the following slides? Thank you. So here we looked at three line amendments to the south area of the cluster, and you can see those here. Appreciate the diagrams are rather complicated, but as with the Broadgate Tall Building Site, you know, the crucial acceptability of these for us was that they did not alter overall the spirit of what the cluster is trying to achieve in this location. So if you see the above image, that is the cluster as submitted at Regulation 19 by us for examination, and below is the amended cluster following the amendments and the discussions at the hearings. The changes really entail moving the lines over three individual sites, which again came forward as part of the statement of common ground discussions we had with individual respondents. I appreciate that the differences might be quite hard to see, and that is indeed a kind of telling sort of quality, really. You know, this is one of the reasons why we felt they were acceptable, because in the south of the cluster here, the profile of it steps down gradually in height towards the Tower of London World Heritage Site, but also towards the river. And as you can see between the two, the amendments don't really alter that overall quality. You know, there are two kind of final flourishes of height at the south of the cluster, and those are 20 Fenchurch Street and 50 Fenchurch Street, apologies, which you can see as kind of two towers that form quite a distinctive end or southern terminus. The changes here, the line amendments, involve moving the contour lines between and around those. I could take you through those in fine detail if you like, following our summary today, but they maintain that sense of the tower, of the cluster stepping down in profile towards the tower, therefore were found to be acceptable by us. And so these have been incorporated into amended maps, so the policy maps, and also wording within the policy itself. And then through the examination, there was a great deal of discussion of proposals of interest as well from our stakeholders in the heritage sector. And these are some of the key modifications that we made to the plan that have been recommended to us by the inspectors as a result. They entail mainly changes to wording, amplification of emphasis on conservation areas, on the OUV of the tower, a reference to the St. Paul's setting study. These we think are really important evidence of the fruitful collaboration we had with these stakeholders, notwithstanding the fact that we were holding very different positions on some of the aspects of the plan. You can see here, actually, we find this to be a plan that is now strengthened in its emphasis on these areas. And we thank, to put on record, we thank the involvement of those stakeholders in the plan and its examination. It was really useful. The one thing which the inspectors did change, actually, was a proposal that we advanced in collaboration with Historic England and Bevis Marks Synagogue to refer to the sky, the consideration of the sky in relevant developments near the synagogue. The inspectors removed this main modification because they did not feel it was necessary to make the plan sound. So I shall pause there for any questions on these modifications.
Yeah, any questions on what you've heard so far? Siobhan, your hand was up.
So can you just go back to the slide with the maps and the contours? Do you mind? So we need to deliver 1.2 million square meters by 2040. Does that modification impact that overall delivery? I mean, I assume the Broadwalk project means that actually we've got excess there, perhaps. But I can also see on some of those numbers, if I'm reading it right, there's an increase in height in some of the schemes. Is that right?
That's quite right. So I think happily these amendments have allowed us to seek a small increase in the overall ability of the plan to deliver floor space. As you refer to, we have a challenging target to meet, and these amendments will help us to do that. They entail increases to the size of the cluster as tabled originally at Reg 19, small increases, but meaningful ones nonetheless. And of course, the Broadgate tall building site allows for a significant, on its own terms, increase in capacity too on that individual site. The largest increase we see here, if we look between the two towers that I mentioned earlier, 20 and 50 Fenchurch Street, we all, I think, know 20 Fen, the walkie-talkie. 50 Fen is the one to the right of it with a more cuboid orthogonal form. There is a site between those called 30 Fenchurch Street, which is quite a broad building, currently occupied by a sort of a glass cuboid type edifice. So the main change here, the largest single increase in the cluster is over that site, where the site can now potentially go to a total of 160 meters AOD instead of 140 approximately, as was originally tabled. So a fairly meaningful increase over that site. The others, we're talking more about increments of 10 or 20 meter increases rather than anything more significant.
And then just on the sort of heritage conversation that was had, because I think we attended one or two meetings. We haven't seen the whole array of meetings you had. I mean, there were a lot of stakeholders who I know were in the room speaking about their concerns and as you said, rightly said, taking opposing views to us. How do you think that was treated by the inspectorate overall? Because I mean, we're not going to be able to go through all the main modifications. Do you feel their concerns were reflected in the new plan?
I think certainly in the main mods we looked at, the textual ones just then, there are amplifications and increases in emphasis around the importance of things like OUV and the St. Paul's setting. But crucially, the more significant changes proposed by those heritage stakeholders, Historic England and others, were not accepted by the inspectors. They did not believe those changes were necessary to make the plan sound. That's really important, I think, to say. The plan as submitted effectively was in this through the inspectors' recommendations here today, has effectively been endorsed by them, our approach that is. And the cluster, as we tabled, despite the significant objections to its form, was found to be sound by the inspectors, to be found unproblematic by them, and our explanation and justification of it in relation to the Tower of London and St. Paul's has been, I think, de facto accepted by the inspectors through the absence of any significant changes to the lines in response to Historic England and others.
Questions? Liz?
Just on the last bit, when you said that the inspectors took out the protection of Bevismark's sky view or whatever. What did they, I mean, because it didn't need to be sound, what did they actually say? Or can you explain more how this happens? Because my concern is because it'll keep coming back and wasting this committee's time if we're always going to vote it down. Wouldn't it be better if it was in there?
Well, I mean, I would agree, and we proposed it to the inspectors for that reason. You know, there was that proposal was the culmination of a long and very involved conversation with the synagogue and with Historic England, who were aligned with their position. You know, it's worth saying actually, you know, as an umbrella thing for this, that the immediate setting policy for the synagogue, which we have proposed, is in the plan, has not been changed by the inspectors. What we had proposed to include was additional text, not policy wording, but additional supporting text to acknowledge that the sky is a consideration when one is contemplating the impacts of development in the area. And the inspectors took only that bit out. They've left the rest of the protections for the synagogue in the plan, which we feel are, you know, go beyond what we need to do as a local authority and emphasize the importance of that very important building. Do you want to come over?
Yeah, if I may just add to this. So obviously this issue was heavily discussed during the examination hearings, and the inspectors very much were keen to emphasise during the hearings the levels and layers of protection that all of our heritage assets enjoy. So both statutory protection in terms of the Town and Country Planning Listed Buildings Act, protection within the National Planning Policy Framework, protection within the city plan itself. Other wording that is generic is perhaps too derogatory a term, but, you know, overarching protection that is within the plan. The inspectors did say and come back to us on their reasoning for removing this, and this is in paragraph 14, which is on page 25 of your reports pack here. So the inspectors have considered, so I'm starting a sentence, 2 sentences into the paragraph. The inspectors have considered this change and have informed the City Corporation that this is not required for soundness reasons, as the identified heritage assets already have legislative and policy protection. They, the inspectors, consider that the apparent elevation of Bevismark Synagogue could have unintended consequences in relation to proposals relating to other designated heritage assets with ambiguity for the decision maker. And the inspectors are very keen to avoid situations where there is potential for ambiguity seen by the decision maker. All of that having been said, these are modifications that will be subject to consultation, and people will have a full opportunity to give their views, and the inspectors will then be considering those and producing a report which sets out their full thinking on the city plan, its soundness and its legal compliance. So all of those issues will no doubt be discussed at that point in time as well.
Thank you. I suppose ambiguity is an important aspect to make sure it's clear for applicants and for decision makers. So I'm really pleased that we have seen immediate setting removed and it's gone back to the normal setting. And I suppose, given what you've just said, the inspectors felt that the National Planning Framework of heritage settings was consistent and unambiguous, and gave that protection rather than having the immediate setting, which I think was very unclear to everybody. What is immediate? Would that be right?
So just a point of clarity, so the immediate setting policy does remain within the plan, but there are points at which the inspectors did consider there to be wording that could be removed or a specific clarification that could be put in to make it clear that that the synagogue and other heritage assets enjoy a setting. In this instance, there is also, both for the synagogue and for the monument, a need to identify an immediate setting. However, there have been changes, modifications that the inspectors have made to clarify the distinction between those two things.
Thank you for that. Thank you. That's really helpful. So on that basis of making sure we're clear, concise and unambiguous, would you not think it's better for us to make that clear in the policy wording rather than just the text? Because I think things get lost in the wash. I think it's really important, having gone through a very
painful experience I think we've all had on the planning committee and the local plan on this issue. Being clear in the policy wording is probably the best way forward. If I let you answer that question, then I've got another question on the last slide we had about enhance and preserve.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm just trying to find the specific modification that was made. I think there was a modification made to the policy wording, but if you just bear with us, I will scroll through the.
Strong enough, clear enough.
Well, while you're doing that, one thing I'll add is you probably got an email from Philip, Kelvin, and I had a chat with Philip about this. And obviously we proposed a form of wording in agreement with other groups, which the inspector said take out. It may be the case that we can find other ways of bringing that wording into other associated documents. One would be, for example, the Conservation Area Management Plan, possibly the SPD. So we're kind of trying to figure out if we can get what we actually originally proposed put back in somewhere, if the right form of words provides clarity and removes ambiguity.
And ultimately, the policy wording is the strongest and clearest way forward. If we can do that, that'd be helpful.
I think we won't be able to make policy changes to inspector modifications. I think we have to basically accept them or scrap the plan today.
Apologies, sorry, I misspoke. The changes to the policy wording, there haven't been specific changes on that point to the policy wording, but I'll pass over to Mr. Van Collis.
So we do have an additional modification which the inspectors have recommended, which slightly rephrases the policy HE18, which is the Bevis Marks immediate setting policy. I'll quote it to you now, just so we all have it. So development in the defined immediate setting of Bevis Marks Synagogue and the monument, and this is the change now, instead of should, will be carefully managed to preserve or where possible enhance the elements of setting that contribute to the significance of these heritage assets. So that is the only modification that the inspectors have recommended to the Bevis Marks immediate setting policy. We do not, but it is in the appendix to your papers. Apologies, yeah, there are quite a few, aren't there? It is page 8 of the additional modifications list. Yeah, so Appendix 2.
So it should be Appendix 2, page 8, within the appendix. Oh, the reports pack pages, sorry. It's in the main pack. I think I found it. Page 58. Is that the one?
Yeah.
It's not page 58, is it?
Okay, so it's page 188 of the supplementary pack, where it says AM70 in the middle between the two boxes, and you'll see on the right hand side point 8 is there. So development in the defined immediate setting of Bevis Marks Synagogue and the monument, remove the word should and then added will be carefully managed to preserve and where possible enhance with the elements of setting that contribute to the significance of these heritage assets. Very good. So that's the change essentially.
Yes, and during the examination, the inspectors heard from the synagogue and from Historic England and from ourselves as to the differing approaches towards the synagogue. And the fact that they haven't included any other changes suggests that they were satisfied with our approach, and that the immediate setting policy just amplifies the importance of the synagogue to the decision maker, draws attention to it more than if we were just relying on the general duty as regards setting.
So while we're on that page, my other point was the brackets where possible enhances. Because I was of the impression that the National Planning Framework for heritage build, I mean that's conservation areas, not heritage. So the heritage policy in National Planning Framework says preserve and enhance, but the conservation is going to be preserve and where possible enhance it. Isn't there again this issue of misinterpretation?
If I may clarify, so the NPPF and the legislation that underpins it imposes a duty to preserve the significance of heritage assets. So it's only to preserve. What we've done in this plan is actively seek to enhance as well as preserve. So enhancing goes beyond what we're required to do and what the NPPF requires. And so throughout the plan, we have a commitment in the heritage policies and elsewhere to seek opportunities proactively to enhance significance and enhance the settings of heritage assets. MM42 up there was agreed with Historic England as a way of giving emphasis to conservation areas, because there was controversy around the removal of a clause that is in the current plan that talks about inappropriate areas and tall buildings and conservation areas and other places. This was a modification made to address that and to address the concerns raised by Historic England and others. And I think now that really is very clear about what tall building proposals should be doing in or near conservation areas.
So that's an added layer of protection, which I think when you do go out to consultation, you might need to explain that so that people understand that is actually another level of protection rather than a removal.
Well, what I would say is the level of protection. What is confusing about this is that the level of protection which is required by legislation, not by our plan itself, stays the same. What the plan does is emphasise certain things as well as replicating what the NPPF requires. Here, the importance of tall buildings and conservation areas and the sensitivity potentially of that type of development is amplified. It's emphasised here, and I think that is very important, and that will address the concerns that were raised by stakeholders at the time.
Thank you. Really good questions. I think Mercy, your hand was up.
Thank you. Apologies if I'm misunderstanding, but the additional paragraph on page 41, MM55, just to understand, what was the process for the inspector presumably requiring the addition of that new paragraph for soundness reasons?
Just to be clear, is 41 of the main pack? Ready, go ahead. We have lots of packs in planning. You'll discover this, Mercy. And the new paragraph is in which of the three boxes?
So it's MM55 and it's the new paragraph after 11.5.12.
Thank you. That's very clear.
So this is the, just for be absolutely clear that we're all talking about the same modification. So this is the modification, the new paragraph after 11.5.12 that talks about sites that contain an existing tall building. Is that right?
Exactly.
Great. So yeah, so as with all of these modifications, well, certainly the vast majority of them, it came about through the representations that were made during the pre-submission consultation and then subsequent statements of common ground. There were a number of developers and landowners promoting sites that were outside of the tall buildings clusters, and there was discussion at the examination as to the best way to approach those sites, given specifically ones that have an existing tall building on them, and effectively the wording here was proposed to address that concern that the plan wasn't looking positively enough at potential development sites where they had an existing tall building on them. And the wording here is effectively to acknowledge that those sites that do contain the existing tall building, that may well be a material consideration in the determination of applications. So it's not a policy as such, it's more a sort of factual acknowledgement that that's something that decision makers may well take into account, which indeed is the case. We have seen that on decisions that have gone through. So that's a kind of the thinking behind that policy, that change. Sorry,
Liz.
Just on that point, is that like going against the idea of clustering then, or not? I mean, that's what the ambiguity, when things seem to get becoming more confusing.
Yeah. So what another route we could have gone down would be to put in a whole load more to respond to these consultations, if that was justified. I think there was the evidence that we had submitted by developers and landowners on the sites where changes were agreed. There was substantial evidence that was put forward, looking at the views, looking at all of the potential impacts on heritage assets for the ones where changes were agreed. So the Broadgate House site, and the ones in the city cluster. There was also evidence that we developed ourselves during the examination process to understand the impacts on heritage assets and the impacts on strategic views of those modifications. And that is obviously necessary if there's going to be a substantive change to the plan itself, to have that evidential basis to make sure the plan is justified. This wording effectively, I don't think it goes against the idea of clustering. Clustering is still very much firmly embedded within the plan. All it does is to identify that an existing tall building may be a material consideration. That's as far as it goes. It doesn't kind of stretch policy and the approach beyond that. But I think Tom wants to add something.
Yes, just to add a coda to what Rob said, the wording itself is, I would say, hardly a ringing endorsement of the idea of additional kind of isolated tall building sites. Clustering is our strategy. It's fundamental to the plan. And we think this wording simply fills a gap, basically. There is this issue which is from time to time needs to be addressed. And this fills that gap without undermining that central clustering strategy, which is the heart of the plan.
Just to be clear on that point, just to give an example, Angel Court was a tall building, and policy change. So when it was built, it was allowed to be that particular height. Then there was a policy change, and if they were to demolish that building and rebuild that height or higher, they would have been at odds with the current policy. And therefore they chose to retrofit. So they kept the core and they brought it down and they rebuilt it back up. Is that what this policy is designed to support? If a tall building was in an area which already has heritage assets and whatever, could it be demolished and rebuilt? So that height, existing height, or how much higher could it go? That's what it's not very, I'm just trying to work out, is this there for that scenario of something like Angel Court, which didn't go any higher, I don't think. It just bigger mass. Or would this allow a building to come down and go back up higher than the original building, which would have been at odds with policy? If you understand that point, sorry.
It's a really good question, and actually one of the most complex areas or sorts of cases in the city, because tall buildings that exist already, which come forward for refurbishment or redevelopment, sometimes we may have a desire to reduce the height of them, and there have been examples where we've done that, like Sudbury House, where we've removed impacts on views of St. Paul's, for instance. But we have to acknowledge that the existing form of the building sets a kind of baseline and is a material consideration when we start to think about that process. And that's what this wording really is there to do, to just provide clarity to everybody that it's very likely that an existing tall building, the fact of it being a tall building, will be a material consideration. What follows then is really all down to the circumstances of the site, its existing impacts, appearance, etc., what the developer's trying to achieve, what we're trying to achieve as well, and that process of collaboration which we always seek to pursue. I mean, there may be instances where tall buildings exist in sort of more low-lying areas where actually they don't particularly have a problematic effect on that area, and therefore the height might be sort of not in question. Those sorts of instances are few in number, actually, and we will always seek to improve and enhance the cityscape where we can. But I think this wording is important because it provides clarity and provides an opener for that conversation to happen. It won't guarantee that a certain thing will happen on these sites or not, if you see what I mean.
So that wouldn't quite be in odds with the mayor's policy about clustering, because this is an existing building and you're not encouraging more buildings around it. So that's just very clear on that point. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, the clustering strategy in the plan, we feel and we hope is so emphatic that these are the areas where tall buildings are acceptable, and that's underpinned by all of the evidence that we submitted. We think that is really clear to everyone, and the fact that there might be occasionally the ability to have an existing tall building go slightly higher or slightly lower, it is more of a minor case that we think can be dealt with on that case-by-case basis and doesn't need that huge weight of evidence underpinning it.
Shravan.
Thank you. Sorry to have a second bite at the cherry, but I just want to ask a little bit about the weighting that the plan now has going forward, because we've got to remember this is a sort of 30,000 foot plan, right? And the idea is it sets framework under which we then have layers of policies to fill in the gaps, if you like. I know the chair's just returned from investor meetings abroad where there is money poised to come to the square mile. If we can move forward with plans, the investment market is ready to move forward. How much weighting does this plan now have if an investor were to come forward or a developer were to come forward and say, look, we understand the new contours, we understand where the limitations are, where the opportunities are. Would we as a planning authority now have to wait until the end of next year to look at planning submissions with the new plan, or can we add weighting to it as we go forward?
Yeah, that's a really good question. We've given quite a lot of thought and legal advice on this. In terms of the approach to weight as plans progress towards adoption, there's some paragraphs set in the NPPF that basically kind of says, depending on its compliance with national policy, well, we consider it that is compliant with national policy in relation to the number of representations that have received and in relation to the stage. So the advice we've been giving case officers is that we can give some limited weight to the plan as a whole at the moment, because we've got to the latter stage of the examination process. But in terms of representations, we know that around half of them are for heritage and tall buildings.
So let's get specific on the new sites you've got for tall buildings in Broadgate. That would have weighting?
That would have only very limited weight at the moment until we've concluded the main modifications consultation and then the inspector's report fact check. Rob wants to come in as well.
Yeah, but just to be clear, obviously, planning takes time. We want it to be quicker, obviously, but our officers, as they're looking at pre-applications in particular and applications that are landing now, are thinking about what's the decision-making environment going to be at that point in time. So the plan obviously will have full weight upon adoption in July, assuming we get to that point, and we'll replace the local plan, all guns blazing. That's the plan, right? Prior to that point, when we get the inspector's report next year, we'll have a really clear steer from the inspectors as to the likely direction of travel. And so we can give the plan really substantial weight in decision making. As I say, officers are looking ahead to that, and we're advising them on what we think is most likely to happen, so that then developers, investors, landowners can act with a greater degree of certainty coming down the line. So hopefully that gives the reassurance that you're seeking.
So obviously, yeah, just in terms of the strategic here, we're debating here something that's gone through all of our process, and then in short, we're pretty well, we the City Corporation are getting what we have asked for, which is excellent. Those considerations that are still out there to be consulted on again, what usually in this process happens there? Are we, in essence, are we going to hear anything new? or have we heard it all before? I don't mean that disrespectfully to any consultees, but is there likely to be anything in your view that will change the inspector's mind, notwithstanding the weasel words, which I understand the without prejudice nature of their opining so far? Because that's really what we're coming to now, because on Siobhan's point there, because I can see here that unless something now materializes that is so considerable that changes the inspector's minds on major points, this will be the plan in summer next year.
I think maybe two things to say. Firstly, the number of modifications we've received, 68, is relatively speaking not very many. Many local authorities, many local plans have hundreds of modifications at this point in time. Now, partly that's the nature of our plan and the nature of their plans, which will be looking at, much larger areas, housing sites, etc. Changes do happen between this point and the inspector's report. We've seen that in other plans. So I don't want to sit here and say this is going to be the plan. And I also don't want to speak for the inspectors who, have their own independent approach here. My instinct is that the plan that we get from the inspectors will broadly be very similar to the plan as now with these modifications. Therefore, I think decision makers can act with a fairly high degree of certainty. But even having said that, we do have to be cautious about the approach. The NPPF does talk about the weight to be given does need to reflect the degree of disagreement on individual policies. And there are policies in this plan where there remains a degree of disagreement and there is still a stage of public consultation. So in relation to the policies on tall buildings and heritage, where there is probably the largest degree of disagreement, we would be advising decision makers to only give those limited weight until particularly we get the inspector's report, which will give us a firmer steer. On other areas, I think we can be much clearer about the approach.
So just as we've got to be respectful of the process and all that. Can I just follow on and say, is there anything then that we should be aiming for? Sounds like gaming the system, but this is a consultation and we're part effectively with a promoter, but we're also at the table, that we should be now doing in this process here, where there are bits of the edges that we feel we should be making representations with others to get what we originally wanted.
I certainly think this is a relatively straightforward consultation at this point in time. It's worth saying that we're effectively acting on the inspector's behalf. Other than the additional modifications which we'll come to, but certainly for the main modifications, effectively they're asking everybody who's been involved and anybody else who has a view for their views about whether those modifications are the right ones. So I think we act in accordance with that and we say this is what the inspectors are asking everybody.
Thank you. It's very interesting to hear the process, particularly how the weighting is considered. I think now we've probably covered those initial main modifications. Did you want to take us through some more? What did you have? Okay, so I'm just going to nip to the loose. So Siobhan, you can take the chair for 1 second.
So just a few more of the more significant modifications to the plan. So one of the modifications we've made is around cycle parking and the requirements for long stay cycle parking. So this is effectively cycle parking that's in office buildings in the city. City Property Association in particular have been promoting this modification and did a report looking at the impacts of cycle parking and have assessed the extent to which they're used in the city and the London Plan standards, and have found that a lot of cycle provision is really heavily underutilised within many of the buildings in the square mile. That has implications obviously for embodied carbon, because if you're digging out big basements, that emits an awful lot of carbon, and that's where the cycle parking goes. We're absolutely clear that we do not want the city to have insufficient cycle parking. It's really vital that we have more than enough cycle parking for people to use in the square mile, and the London, we can't change the London plan standards. That would lead us to a situation where we're not in conformity with the London plan. However, what we've been able to do, and TfL have also had sight of this and have not objected to it, is a modification that says where in exceptional circumstances where those standards cannot be met, a contribution towards wider cycling infrastructure may be acceptable, and or temporary use of those facilities for some other function could also be an acceptable thing. So it's something that it sounds like it's a relatively minor thing. It is a relatively minor thing in the grand scheme of the city plan taken as a whole, but it is something that we've heard loud and clear from the development industry that this is a concern of theirs.
Yeah, and I think the CPA did a report on this, and there are just a large number of these enormous cycle basements that are not being used. And whilst it sounds more sustainable to have them to encourage cycling, the reality is the amount of concrete that has to be poured makes the net effect far more carbon intensive for this unused space. So there has to be a flexibility, I think, and this appears to be quite a good solution to providing that flexibility, particularly if there's a contribution to our infrastructure for cycling. Siobhan.
Thank you. I think this will actually dramatically change viability for a lot of schemes that are stuck. So be interesting if we've granted consent on a scheme already that has that is in compliance with the current London plan, would we accept modifications to that now if that were to change the viability for them to proceed with construction? That's one question. The second one is, I'm a little worried about the language at the end of this. Temporary use for ancillary uses may be acceptable. You know, if you've built your building and you've got 7 stories of underground cycle parking that's completely underutilized, why would we have to have a temporary use? Why couldn't you just modify that to something that's more functional and you know, sustainable in the long term? Is that something we could perhaps query with the inspector on that specific languaging?
Well, I mean, I think I'd say that obviously these are the inspector's modifications, so it's what they consider to be appropriate at this point in time. I think we will hear back, no doubt, from the City Property Association and others during that consultation, and we'll have an opportunity as the City Corporation to respond to those to any suggestions that come back through the modification. So that's the time at which we could consider whether this is exactly the right language that's been put forward in the main modification. I think that's the point to do that. I think in terms of existing sites, I mean, obviously the policy and the plan doesn't act retrospectively. You know, if those sites have been agreed, that is what has been agreed. But if they were to come in for a modification to their scheme and to say, right, this is the different approach we want to take, then that's something we would have to consider and would want to consider very carefully.
Just purely on a climate action basis and a sustainability basis, pouring concrete down there because we've approved something on paper just makes no sense at all.
Yeah, I mean, I agree in principle. And this is just the other thing just to say is that there are discussions ongoing with the CPA, ourselves and TfL on this very point to try and really get to the bottom of exactly what the you know, what the numbers are, what's the demand here, and to make sure that TfL, who they're very keen to listen to this and to understand the implications for the city, for the next London plan, I should say, and for their work on individual schemes as they're coming forward. So I think this is something we're all learning on all of the time, but we do want to get it right.
Thank you. Hugh.
They say that there's nothing more permanent than a temporary solution. Is there any definition in planning law to for temporary, or could that effectively become a permanent change?
So I think what we would do is we would look to set certain parameters within that with the developer to understand, okay, what are the trigger points for this? So is it something that, is there a way that we can monitor the uptake of cycling there? If it is found that, you know, there's a massive shift in demand upwards, then we can secure that through Section 106, through various management and monitoring plans, and we can then say to the inspector, right, you've reached a trigger point, sorry, to the applicant, you've reached a trigger point and you now need to provide more cycle parking in this instance. I don't know whether, you know, if it's never been used over 20 years, then it starts to feel like it isn't a temporary thing anymore, is it? And the developer may well come to us and say, right, we want to change the use for this particular part of our scheme, and that would be considered as any normal planning application would. It wouldn't involve the whole building, it could just involve part of the scheme.
Any more questions on cycle parking before we ask officers to move on? No, thank you all.
I'm covering this bit.
Yep.
Yeah, okay, good to know. So just a few other of the main modifications that we've made to the plan. The first one was an articulation of a short vision for the city plan. So members will be aware that the submitted plan included strategic priorities within Chapter 1 and set across the three strategic objectives: the economic, the environmental and the social objectives that underpin sustainable development. And it was raised during various representations through the consultation that perhaps a little more clarity around this could be helpful. So a vision has been developed that sets out, I think, fairly concisely what the aims of the city plan are in terms of the future of the square mile. Modifications have also been made in relation to housing delivery rates within the plan. Just to be clear, that doesn't affect the housing target for the city plan. This is about making sure that the plan is clear that it can deliver the housing that it's required within the London plan and within national policy as well. The third one on this list is a requirement that we've put in for to recognise effectively a secondary number by which we monitor office development. So members will be aware that the minimum requirement set out in the city plan was a minimum of 1.2 million square meters. Now that's a net internal area figure. That's effectively the usable office space of buildings. Within the square mile, we've done studies looking at developments, and roughly speaking, it does vary on a site-by-site basis. There's a NIA is roughly 75% of the gross internal area. So that includes secondary spaces, cores in particular, lift cores, particularly on tall buildings, are really intensive uses of space. So we felt it's important to have both of those numbers in the plan, primarily for monitoring purposes. As we take the plan through, it's much easier to monitor the gross internal area than the net internal area, because that's a figure that we get on the planning applications. So we've included that. So that's why you'll see two numbers, 1.2 million for NIA, 1.6 million for GIA, but both remain a minimum figure. There were representations made by the City Property Association and others seeking to increase the minimum figure and make it something more like 1.5 or even 1.9 million, the upper end of the range that was in our evidence base, but that wasn't something that the inspectors have taken forward in their main modifications. There is also modification MM23, and this is a modification that in particular responded to representations made by the Home Builders Federation around the delivery of infrastructure, particularly water supply. Now, the water supply infrastructure providers have a legal obligation to provide sufficient water supply and to plan ahead to deliver that. There was representations made that the plan wasn't clear enough, that the onus was on them to do that rather than on developers themselves to fix effectively the water supply function or to not build their buildings because there was insufficient water supply. So we've made it very clear that the developers, the landowners, promoters of sites have an obligation to consult and to engage with infrastructure providers, not only for water, but for all other types of infrastructure. But it's clearer where that obligation lies in terms of providing the infrastructure. And then the final change here is MM68, and this is in response to a representation made by the Mayor of London. The London plan sets out a clear hierarchy for developer contributions, developer obligations, which puts affordable housing first, then public transport improvements second, and then other forms of infrastructure as lesser priorities, but still important for delivering improvements to public realm, etc. We've simply reflected that change that's already in the London plan, so that it's clear that there isn't a conflict between what we're asking for and what the London plan is asking for.
Rob, thank you very much. So as we're on other changes, I think, Jackie, you may have a question
So I just wanted to ask a question about air quality and why we haven't pushed at having an actual target in the plan. I know there's references to other policies and documentation that obviously link in, but is there a reason there isn't an actual target in the plan? And given the consultation period, is that something that could be explored?
So I think that's probably something I'd like to take away and give you a specific answer on, if that's okay. My understanding is that the changes were made in response to the representations by the Mayor on conformity with the London Plan, or at least alignment with the London Plan, I should say, and those changes were then informed by internal discussions with our officers who are leading on air quality policies and the delivery of our air quality strategy. I think my understanding is that the targets, that there are legally binding targets that we have for delivery of air quality, and that those still stand and those are part of our air quality strategy. I'm off the top of my head, I don't think I have an answer for you on exactly why they're not included in the plan itself, but if it's okay, I'm very happy to get back to you on that.
Great, thanks, Rob. I have another, if that's all right. The other is on the daylight and sunlight, and this is really about the changes to the way people live and work in their homes in the city. And you know, this has obviously been considered in the plan, but I just wonder if there's further it could go. Just thinking about the developments coming up, and the fact that they stand shoulder to shoulder with residential buildings. Can we push further in terms of what the inspector has come back with, but also what we're thinking about? Because this is you've said it's a 10-year development. We've gone through COVID. People are living very differently in their homes in the city. So I'm just interested to know if there could be a stronger review of daylight, sunlight, and what we mean by that in terms of people now working from their bedrooms.
Yeah, and certainly this was an area where there was extensive discussion at the examination in public around daylight and sunlight and the approach in the plan. The inspectors were satisfied with the approach that was set out within the plan itself, and felt that that was something that, well, they haven't included substantial main modifications, I think, on that on the daylight and sunlight requirements. It's certainly something that we take very seriously and look at very closely in all of the applications that come forward, and we get really extensive reports produced to make sure that daylight and sunlight is fully factored in and considered as part of the approach that we take. Daylight and sunlight guidance is one of those frustratingly technical aspects. The BRE have really clear guidance on the approach that should be taken, albeit it's something that is quite technical and complex, and that's the right approach for us to be following and for us to be taking.
I did actually, that's a bit selfish, but I do have one around the consultation. So it was really helpful just hearing a bit more detail around what consultation would look like, and some of this could potentially be explored further in the next stage. And I suppose with that in mind, just going back to your comments about how useful the consultation was in terms of developing this and getting it to this stage, particularly with stakeholders, including residents. And I cannot go without talking about residents, because obviously I'm the resident engagement lead, and I'm interested, as you know, in consultation and how we do that really effectively, and improve that, possibly even do less, but do it better. So I'm going to ask the question, given the experience of getting it to this point, working with residents, is there, in the next process of consultation, is there appetite to consider a peer review around developments directly affecting residential? Or some form of peer review, Rob?
It's a novel suggestion. Well, it's a new suggestion I've not heard before. I mean, I think there is, I suppose, first of all, to say that the City Corporation is the local planning authority, and it is up to the City Corporation as decision makers, both a delegated stage, or whether that's delegated or whether that's by committee, it is their decision to make. And I certainly wouldn't want there to be any suggestion that, you know, we're sort of discharging our obligations on that, you know, and we have a really substantial and I think very well equipped team internally compared to many other local authorities to be able to advise and inform members on their decision making. So it's certainly not something that I'm aware of. As I say, it's the first time I've heard that suggestion. But if it's something that the chair and deputy would like to take away,
it is. We're probably slightly straying off of the mods conversation, but Jackie, we have informally spoken about this. I suggest we have another chat and just have a think about not necessarily our consultations, but those that the developers do for their schemes. And if there's if we want to review the protocol and the standard, that'll be a conversation that we can have with an officer. That's okay. Thank you. Marianne.
Thank you. Just going on MM1, and we've got the lovely 5 headliners here. There's no actual reference at all to the residents and the residential value. The value that residents, not residential value, the value that residents actually bring to the City of London, which, you know, they are a key stakeholder. Without residents, there'd be certain functions that the corporation wouldn't be allowed to carry out, planning being one of them. And therefore, is there any opportunity to add a 6th bullet point, which would mention the value that residents bring to the city and their housing and amenity needs, which are catered for in the plan, because I think that's sort of touches on the air quality and the daylight and sunlight issues as well. It's those residential amenities which are very important, and as Jackie points out, people working from home more, and it's an issue that constantly comes up when we have planning applications and the impact on daylight and sunlight. On page 36, could I just ask this question on MM22? It says, do not result in underlying unacceptable adverse impacts on the amenity of neighbouring occupiers, including cumulative impact. What's the definition of unacceptable? That's always the issue. My unacceptable could be different to yours, would be different to yours. Do we have a baseline so that we understand what that actually means? And then my last point would be page 49, AM57. So that's really good. I love the infrastructure policy, putting the onus on the developers to ensure that there is the water and the electricity, especially during the construction, because otherwise we end up with these horrible diesel smelling generators. So that was great. And on this one, again, the development has to demonstrate the impact of daylight and sunlight. And I love to see that we've added, including churchyards, which are incredibly important open spaces. But do they have to take in the community? Does the developer have to take in the cumulative impact on daylight and sunlight, or are we? Do they have to demonstrate that their development, having taken in cumulative impact, will not have an unacceptable effects? Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah, so maybe I'll take those in reverse. So yeah, cumulative impact is something that we look at both in terms of daylight and sunlight issues and in terms of things like impacts on heritage assets when we're doing fuse impact assessments and heritage impact assessments. And that cumulative impact takes account of, you know, obviously the existing situation, the developments that have been approved as well, and the proposed development that's in front of decision makers. So that cumulative impact is absolutely the approach that we take. In terms of the change on CV4, so this is the hotels policy, and proposals for hotels and other visitor accommodation will be permitted where they do not result in unacceptable adverse impacts on the amenity of neighbouring occupiers. This was a change. I actually don't remember if it's something the inspectors themselves flagged during the examination, but it was certainly something that was raised during the examination hearings. And they were very clear, the inspectors were clear in their questioning of us and of other stakeholders, that the plan should avoid situations that effectively lead to sort of unintended consequences. And the original wording, do not result in adverse impacts, suggests that even a very minor, very minuscule impact would result in non-compliance with the policy, and the intention therefore is just to make it clear that there has to be a degree of unacceptability to those adverse impacts. And there are, I think, other places within the plan where we've used that language, and they wanted to make sure that it was consistently used in the plan. So that's the reasoning there.
Have no definition or
No, that's right.
scale of unacceptable, and there's no legal definition, so it would be the Oxford Dictionary's definition of unacceptable.
Yeah, exactly. A straightforward interpretation of the plan is always what we would expect decision makers to take, and it is therefore up to decision makers to use their judgment in making those decisions as to whether the impacts would be acceptable or would be unacceptable, informed by evidence submitted as part of the examination and by the expertise of officers that were advising.
And this ultimately is why we have a planning committee, which is when schemes come to the planning committee, there are occasionally, if not frequently, these grey areas where we make judgments. So it could be on that definition of acceptable or unacceptable. It could be over terms like in general conformity of or less than substantial. And that's ultimately the reason we have a committee rather than a planning application by algorithm. Am I right?
Yes, absolutely. And decision makers, both at both the members at the committee and officers, when they make those decisions, have a duty to consider, you know, a straightforward interpretation of the plan, informed by the evidence and informed by the proposal that's put before them. And
before you come to the last point on vision, I think Mercy, you wanted to come in on this.
So yeah, as a counsellor who has lots of noise casework, this was particularly interesting to me as well. I just wondered how that change, the addition of unacceptable, relates to the agent of change principle in the London plan. So how is it related to the management and mitigation of noise? Thank you.
Absolutely. So the London plan, of course, is part of our development plan. It is something that we look to in decision making, as well as being an overarching plan for the delivery of local plans within London as a whole. So the agent of change principle is both in the London plan, but it is effectively our agent of change principle as well. And we would look to advise members to implement that, and to where there are proposals that are coming forward that would impact on existing established businesses, to think about what could be done to the proposal and how the proposal can mitigate those the potential for conflicts to arise. So the agent of change principle is there. There are also a number of policies within this plan and within the London plan that protect amenity, both in terms of residents and in terms of other sensitive receptors. It's a technical term, but you know, people who may be affected.
Now, I know, Mariam, we haven't answered your last question. Liz, is it on this point, Liz? Yes. Is it on this particular point on noise and definitions? Okay, well, not sure what happened. No idea why. So it's on a different point. Ah, fine. So we'll go back. So let's go back to that before we go to the new final point from Marianne.
I think I misunderstood what you said, but what it sounded to me that you said that, yes, a new development, we will look at other recent developments and that will be cumulative. And my understanding previously, it was like two going through at the same time. That were the only things that were cumulative in daylight and sunlight. So is there a change to what I thought it was?
No. So just to be really clear on this, if I can, hopefully, there's a baseline situation. There's the existing real world, right? The cumulative takes into account not only the existing real world plus the development proposal, but the existing real world plus the development proposal plus other proposals that have been approved. So it's as we have always approached it.
You were like my phone, which was clearly confused by that conversation. Thank you. Good question. Now, Mariam, we'll come back to your last point, which you asked first, which is on vision.
Sorry, perhaps me confusing things. Yeah, the vision. So part 4 of the vision talks about a more inclusive and healthier city. And it goes on to say the city has been shaped by and for all of its communities, including those that live, work, visit, study, or worship in the city, and it goes on to talk about that. And I think I'm right in saying that that was changed during the examination hearings because it was suggested that it was unclear what it was meant by communities, by the city's community.
We added in the definition.
So that the effectively the expansion of communities, talk about those that live, work, visit, study, or worship in the city, helps to ensure that that understanding of communities is
Rob,
clear.
sorry, just what status does this have? Is this a modification, or is this just this is a modification? Okay,
Yes.
that's very clear. I mean, I would have thought, just from a wordsmithing point, no other group is mentioned in any other paragraph. That paragraph 4 kind of captures the communities, and it's nice that they've led actually in that with residents as the first group that I mentioned. So hopefully that gives it due prominence.
But it doesn't actually sort of really articulate the value that the residents bring to the City of London. And we are, and I'll say that as a resident, you know, we're not visitors, we are permanent stakeholders. You are our only local authority. Without us, you wouldn't have a planning committee, you wouldn't have lots of other things. And I just think it would, for the city to actually be able to articulate and form words which actually recognise our value, by doing that, you will actually imprint that into the DNA of the city, and you will actually start to value us residents. Without that, I fear that this plan, again, is really missing an opportunity.
Great. I think that's noted. And I think I would therefore encourage you and others to share that view through this coming consultation process to express it. And that can then be heard by the inspectors as the sausage machine handles continue to turn. Now, colleagues, this has been a really helpful process. Firstly, I'd like to say to our officers, and I know I've said this before, but thank you for all the hard work you put in. This has gone on a very long time. It was very impressive to see you present the plan to the inspectors at the beginning of the year, and I do appreciate how much work has gone in. Thank you to colleagues for a really useful debate. I'm just reminding you, today all really we're being asked to do at the bottom of page 21 is to recommend the approval of a 6-week consultation period on the main and additional modifications to the city plan, the sustainability appraisal review, and the changes to the policies map. This subsequently, this paper in a similar form will go to P&T and then to P&R. Then after the process, as you heard outlined, it'll come back for final adoption.
Quick question, when we do go out to consultation, will we actually have the inspectors actual wording of their recommendations? Will that actually be in a document?
So all of the documentation that will go to consultation is before you. So we have 2 tables, which are the table of main modifications and the table of additional modifications. We have the plan itself with the changes in blue and red for main and additional. And that's the sum total of, and there are other supporting documentations, the sustainability appraisal review, habitats, sort of legal technical stuff that is important but isn't particularly substantial. So that's what's going to go out. There isn't something else from the inspectors at this point in time. We will then get an inspector's report, which will be a longer document explaining their thinking, and that will come back after the modifications.
Very good. I'm going to bring this to a vote now, colleagues. I think we've had a good discussion. Can I just therefore ask all of those in favour of the recommendation on the bottom of page 21 to please raise your hand? Shaman, you did. Okay, well done. I thought you were going to put your hand up. Okay, that's carried. I don't think we need to count the votes in this committee. Thank you all. There'll be another bite at the cherry at P&T, but really appreciate all your time this morning.